Now let's get a view on this from Capitol Hill. Missouri Senator Eric Schmitt serves on the Committee of Armed Services as well as Commerce, Science, and Transportation. Please welcome Republican Senator Eric Schmitt. Good morning. Thanks for being here with us.
Sure.
So, we began this hour, I was talking to Tim Hapey about the First Amendment, and I wanted to start by asking you what your definition or understanding is of what speech is allowed and prohibited by the First Amendment.
Well, I think taking a step back and understanding what the First Amendment really represents is the most important thing, and I think that has been lost, I think, in the lack of civics education, whether it's at K through 12 or even on college campuses. It protects fundamental human expression. We believe in our country in individual rights, and paramount in that is that people can express themselves. They can have a point of view, whether it's certainly the written word, the spoken word. There's a reason why it was the very First Amendment, the ability to have a free and open press, to petition your government. These are things that we believe, and I believe, are just sort of fundamental to the human experience. And I'm sort of one of these people that, when you get into these discussions, I'm sure we will, of what qualifies and what doesn't, to me, you combat speech you don't like with more speech, not censorship. And I do think there's a growing trend, even among government leaders, to creep into this space with justification, to put pressure on these platforms, because a lot of these discussions have transformed from the public square, the traditional public square, to the online town square, right? And there's a danger in that in one way, in that you don't have face-to-face conversations as much. And I think that's really important because you're able to process how someone is receiving information. We're in a different place now, right? Where it can be anonymous, but it's certainly faceless in many ways.
So you are a senator now. Of course, you were the Attorney General of Missouri when the case that was heard before the Supreme Court this term, Murthy versus Missouri, which had to do with alleging that the Biden administration was censoring big tech and tech platforms. The Supreme Court disagreed with that in the Fifth Circuit. I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
Only for lack of standing. They didn't really reach the merits. But yeah, I was the Attorney General that brought that case. And I think what was uncovered was chilling. So the big takeaway for me is what was exposed. And you got to remember, this was before Twitter files. This was in May of 2022. And I mean this sincerely, I don't care what your political stripe is. A lot of this stuff ought to scare the bejesus out of every American. The brazen attempts to put pressure on social media companies to take down posts. So you had essentially the power of the federal government colluding with some of the biggest companies in the history of the world. In an individual, you have no real recourse. And so we brought the case, it was exposed. My hope is that we take a step back from that. And again, it doesn't matter what political parties in power controls those levers, the ability for people to sort of have a point of view, even if it's one you disagree with, and even if it's one you think is outrageous, censorship should be sort of out of bounds here. So
I should note that Justice Coney Barrett actually said that, to your point of the standing, that the factual findings of the district court unfortunately appeared to be erroneous. So I'm just curious your thoughts on that. If she's
but that's not sort of dicta, right? That's not the actual ruling. And by the way, there's a federal judge in the federal circuit court too said this was Orwellian. So again, whether you think it got to a point of coercion or not, the fact is the emails are the emails. The text messages are the text messages. And when you have the Surgeon General of the United States texting directly with a senior vice president of a social media company saying, take this down or else, and then them responding, say, we did that, what else can we do? I don't know. This ought to be something that unites Americans, in my view. I don't view that as a particularly partisan thing. I think it's just dangerous.
So what do you think now as we're thinking about this upcoming election, as we talk about platforms, misinformation? We know that there are foreign actors that are actively engaged in disinformation campaigns to destabilize American democracy. How do you suggest platforms, what's your philosophy of how platforms should be dealing with that?
Well, I think they have to choose. So there's two buckets. There's what is the government's role, right? And that's when you get to the censorship,
Sure.
right? What's prohibited by the First Amendment. And so that's what that case was about, which was a little bit different. And personally, I think that we need to change the culture of people who think they can do this within government. But on the private side, they are private businesses, but they kind of have to choose. The reason why they have Section 230 protections is because in 1996 in the Telecommunications Act, they were protected and they were given immunity because they're an open platform. They're not a publisher. You know, Axios, if it writes something that's libelous, can be sued. The social media companies are immune from that because they're held out as an open forum. So they kind of have to pick. That's my point of view. And so,
What do you think they should be if they have to pick?
if I had my way, they'd be an open platform.
Okay.
That you could actually have people go on there and have this airing out. And I do think from a society perspective, the First Amendment is sort of this pressure release valve. You know, this idea in this country is that we can solve our differences and get to resolution through elections and speech, not through political violence, is a really important thing to hold on to. And so the more that people feel like they can be heard, whether it's on a college campus or online, I think that helps. Again, it's sort of cathartic. And so my hope is that they would be true platforms. But I do think it's dangerous. Do I think there's disinformation and misinformation? Yes. But I also think it's being used by some for more power and more control over other people's speech.
Senator, let's talk about college campuses. All of the protests that we saw this past school year, particularly at the end of the school year. How do you think colleges like Columbia should have handled it?
Well,
particular when it comes, obviously, to the Israel-Gaza war.
Sure. I think students need to be protected. I mean, you had images of Jewish students, you know, fearing for their lives locked in a library. That's totally unacceptable. But people do have a right to have objectionable points of view, right? People have the ability to say things that you don't agree with and that you find despicable. And so I think that college administrators, in many ways, have sort of created this problem in that only one side of a debate is often heard. And I'm 49, so that's pretty young in the Senate. It's pretty old in real life. But when I was in college, I sought out lectures or speeches from speakers that I didn't agree with. I think there's got to be a cultural shift where that's more acceptable. You can't have one point of view sort of in the bleachers.
So when you're saying only one side, you're saying the liberal side.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
So it's interesting because as we were just looking at the report from the Knight Foundation, how students who are students of color or who are LGBT say they're self-censoring because they're afraid.
Yeah, I've heard that might be true. And that's wrong too, right? People should be able to speak out. But I've heard from plenty of conservative students who don't feel like they can express themselves in a classroom because they're going to get a bad grade. That's, I think, where we've gotten, and that's wrong. And that takes leadership to correct. But again, I'm old enough to remember when liberals actually espoused the idea of free speech. And I think the pressures you see on the restrictions on free speech, if you're being honest about it, most of it's coming from the left.
So I'm curious what you think Congress's role should be in regulating this. Your colleagues in the House floated some ideas around restricting research funding, tax exemption, potentially more for universities that don't take action against anti-Semitic activity. Are you planning on supporting or introducing anything in the Senate regarding that?
Well, I think, again, you have to have the distinction between pure speech and then the violence or sort of occupation of campuses. Those are two different things, right? Mm-hmm. But I also think that, you know, for me, legislation that I brought forward, I think that tackles the root cause and the fundamental issue here is, for social media companies, you got to choose. You don't, if you're going to engage in this kind of censorship, you don't get Section 230 protections. And on the government side, if you're an individual government actor, if you're a bureaucrat that's engaged in censorship, you yourself can be sued individually by an individual for violating their First Amendment rights. I think right now there's no real accountability for people who violate that, and I think that dynamic needs to change. It shouldn't have to be one attorney general or 5 attorneys general suing it. I think empowering an army of citizens would be a smart move.
In a few minutes, our last guest is we're going to be hearing from the DOE's Assistant Secretary Catherine Lehman about civil rights investigations. Of course, it's the Department of Justice that's charged with protecting free speech. What's your philosophy about what the DOJ should be doing around this?
Well, I think the Department of Justice has lost a lot of credibility, to be perfectly honest with you. I think their desire to pursue political opponents does great harm to the trust that people have in our institutions. And that has widespread ramifications. But, you know, I think this Justice Department is overtly political. And so I don't think there's a lot of trust that they would be even-handed about it.
One last question for you as we're deep into this presidential campaign cycle, and we were just talking about the Department of Justice. Your name has surfaced as a potential Attorney General pick should former President Trump be reelected. Have you had any conversations with him about that?
I am very focused on being a senator from Missouri, and by the way, helping him win. There's no secret. I support President Trump. But that's not my focus right now. So I know that's a very Washington answer, but it's the truth. I was going to
say, so no conversations?
I'm trying to help him win, and I'm trying to represent the people in my state. That's it.
All right. Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have. Senator Schmitt, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for hosting this. Yep.
Please stick around for our final guest this morning as well.